Hello, today I want to take a look at a wine that I've seen billed as the best ever New Zealand wine bargain. The wine concerned is from a producer called Vinoptima. It's their 2011. It's from a grape variety called Gewurztraminer. It's from Ormond in the Gisbourne region of the North Island, and it's marked as a Jubilee Reserve wine. Now, this wine, Vinoptima's Gewurztraminer, was the passion project of a single winemaker called Nick Nobilo, and it is central to the tragedy of a gifted winemaker and his obsession with trying to make the world's best Gewurztraminer. Now, Nicolas Thomas Nobilo has the letters ONZM after his name. He's an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit, a position he gained in 2015 for his services to winemaking. Nick has made a number of claims, probably justified. He claims to have been the first New Zealand winemaker to use new oak to ferment Chardonnay, and also claims to be the first to produce commercial quantities of both Pinot Noir and Gewurztraminer. This happening over 50 years ago in the early 1970s. Nick was part of the pioneering Nobillo family of winemakers, a family winemaking dynasty that claims origins in Europe going back to 1696. Nick's parents, Nikolas and Zuma, came to New Zealand in 1937 and, having worked in various industries, settled in a place called Huapai in West Auckland, where they started planting vines and making wine. Now, Nick was Nicolas and Zuma's second son, and his career in wine pretty much spans the development of modern New Zealand winemaking. As a family, Nobillo were part of the move away from hybrids and the planting of vitis vinifera vines, significantly also being early adopters of varieties such as Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and of course Sauvignon Blanc. And throughout the 60s and 70s, Nick was a central figure in this family-owned winery that grew to become one of New Zealand's largest wineries, before going on to be bought out and become a multinational player when in 2000 the Australian firm BRL Hardy purchased Nobilo's. Subsequently, Hardy's became part of Constellation, and then after that Constellation sold the Nobilo brand as we know it today to Ernst & Julio Gallo. So from 2000, with the takeover of the firm, working with his new winery, Nick returned to a near one-man wine growing business. In fact, he famously said that he set up his winery so that it could be managed by just 2 people. Now, the name Vinoptima is Latin, of course. It just means best wines. And Nick saw this name as honouring 8 generations of his family that had made wine both in New Zealand and before that in Croatia. And Vinoptima seems to have been pretty much unique in being an estate and a winery entirely dedicated to the production of just one grape variety, that grape variety being Gewurztraminer. Nick established a 9.7 hectare vineyard in the Ormond district of the Gisbourne region on the east coast of New Zealand's North Island. He completed a purpose-built winery for the production of this wine in 2000, and his first vintage released was the 2003 Reserve Gewurztraminer. And that wine and the wines that followed really did manage to gain some great critical acclaim. At one stage, this was selling as one of New Zealand's most expensive wines. Now, the winery was entirely established as a result of Nick's passion for Gewurztraminer. And this was a passion gained from intimate work, planting vineyards with the variety and working with it in the Gisbourne region since the 1980s. Now, Nick's interest had started when he became the first person to plant a significant amount of Gewurztraminer in New Zealand as far back as 1972. And as he worked with it over the following 3 decades, he fell more and more in love with the variety. And his goal with Vinoptima was simply to make the wine that was acknowledged as the world's best Gewurztraminer. Now, the vineyards here are divided into 2 blocks of roughly equal size. The first block planted was the South Block, and that was planted in 2000. And then the newer North Block was planted in 2007. Now, the vineyards were planted with 5 different clones of Gewurztraminer, and these were clones that Nick had specially selected over the years of working with Gewurztraminer, seeing those as being the best available to him. I talked about this being an expensive wine. As an example of that, the 2008 in 2013 was on sale at 105 New Zealand dollars. Unfortunately, the issue was that there really wasn't a large enough market for Gewurztraminer at that price. And obviously unsold wine is a problem for any winery. It certainly was for Vinoptima. And August 2018 saw the company put into receivership. Evidently at that stage they had 100,000 litres of unsold wine. That's about 2 vintages worth. And the company went under with debts that were reported as being at least $6 million. And such an ending is incredibly sad for a project that has been created and pursued with so much passion. But it should also be a cautionary tale for anybody who thinks that merely making excellent wine is a key to wine industry success. Now, this wine is labelled as Jubilee Reserve, it just says at the top of the label there, and that differs actually. Most of the bottlings of this wine that I've seen have been labelled as either Reserve or Grand Reserve. Evidently what the difference there is that the Jubilee Reserve suggests that this is a wine that's been retained at the winery and has only been released after 15 years in bottle. This is currently being sold by a wine merchant in Auckland. I will leave the page on the Wine Searcher website where you can find that in the notes below, and they say they're selling this wine for the liquidator. Suffice it to say, I didn't pay over $100 for this. This was selling at $16.99, so I think there's quite a good argument that this is a very good buy. The note I have about the 2011 vintage is that it was a long, slow ripening season, and actually that encouraged them to pick later and to get a fuller, richer style than has normally been the case with these wines. Now, I've seen some quite detailed notes about the winemaking here. I mean, to the extent that everything being hand-picked, but on arrival at the winery, there was a weighing station and weights were recorded against the row number, against clone IDs. All of this is being part of a system of continuous improvement and improved selection within the vineyard. The bunches were hand sorted, largely to remove leaves and debris, but also, I guess, to get rid of damaged or unripe fruit. The bunches moved into the destemmer. Having been destemmed, the berries were then gently pressed in rollers and then put through a must transfer pump and then a heat exchanger where they were cooled down. The fruit then went into 2 6-ton custom-built cooled draining tanks. The skins, the pulp and the juice macerated together for a period of 12 to 18 hours. From there, the free-run juice was allowed to drain into refrigerated tanks for cold settling, with the rest of the contents of the tank being gently pressed and the pressed juice being kept separate from the free-run at this stage. The free-run juice was allowed to settle for 4 days, being racked off any lees that remained there, and the juice was racked and returned from these tanks over a period of 2 weeks, at which stage juice from different sections of the vineyard and pressings were blended. Fermentation went ahead in a combination of stainless steel tanks and large German oak ovals, so large barrels, and cooling allowed a slow fermentation to go on at quite cool temperatures in order to ensure that the intense spicy nature of the juice was passed on into the wine. At the end of May, fermentation was stopped, and the different fermenting lots will have had different levels of residual sugar remaining, and these were combined. Lactic fermentation was blocked in order to ensure that the wine retained its lovely fruitiness and to maintain as much of the wine's acidity as possible. And the individual parcels were tasted, and then a selection was made of the final blend. The reserve bottling aged then in a combination of both tank and oak for a period of 10 to 11 months, allowing the components to marry in the bottle prior to release. And so my understanding therefore is that the Jubilee Reserve is simply a wine that has aged for longer in bottle at the producer's cellars. So let's take a look at the wine, shall we? It's a really very impressive amber colour, golden amber. The wine has 14.5% of alcohol and is throwing some tears quite readily. The notes I've seen also suggest that the wine has probably at least 20 grams per litre of residual sugar, and so that will help make it a little bit thicker and richer as well. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? There really is a lovely combination of sort of toffee-ish caramel notes, almost a sort of a burnt sugar edge, but all that is overlaying a really lovely richness. People talk about Gewurztraminer having notes of Turkish delight or rose petals. This is much more on the sort of the Turkish delight end of the spectrum. It's a richness and a ripeness. It doesn't quite have the elevated perfume I'd think of with a rose petal there. There are notes of sort of rich fruit, almost like a lychee or something like that. But then also there's an awful lot of development there. There are sort of notes of raisin, sultana, perhaps also some sort of complex notes of it. It's almost approaching maderization. I wouldn't say necessarily so, but sort of candied peel, toffee apple, that sort of richness. And the fruit is really quite pronounced and relatively powerful. So let's have a taste. The wine is relatively rounded, medium to full bodied, quite rich. Seems relatively dry and drying. There isn't an obvious sweetness, and there isn't a particularly high or sharp acidity. There is a degree of freshness. There's quite an intensity of sort of candied lemon peel, but no pure mineral acidity cutting through this. You get that sort of initial note of Turkish delight, moving on much more to rich notes of caramel, perhaps even with some sort of slightly drying, phenolic, almost sort of charcoal hints on the finish. Now the alcohol at 14.5% is, I think, providing some warmth, but it doesn't seem big or hot because there's a good concentration of this rich caramelized fruit on the mid palate. Moving through these sort of slightly drying phenolic hints, maybe that's where you do see a tiny bit of the influence of the acidity, and again that's picking up some sort of caramelized notes and notes of candied peel. And there, in that slightly mouth-watering end to the wine, you can continue to see some of those Turkish delight notes enduring as well. I think this is a fascinating wine. I think it's fully mature. I also think this is a style of wine that has body, good alcohol, concentration of fruit that could probably last for another 10 years or so. It's interesting, sometimes you see these styles of wine in southern Germany and Alsace. They rely on body and richness to be able to age. One thing that I think is undeniable about the wines of Vinoptima is that Nick Nobilo did manage to produce a really high quality Gewurztraminer. I took a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this, and there isn't actually an individual score for this vintage, but if you look at the score for all the vintages, that's 91 out of 100. This vintage I did find a score that Ian Daggeter had given it of 93 out of 100, and I think that's a lot more in keeping with what I'm tasting here. This is a high quality wine, I think, from a good vintage where a longer ripening season has really given some depth and richness to the fruit. So yes, I think my scoring of this wine is in line with Ian Daggeter at 93 out of 100. I'm very glad that I bought a few bottles so that I'll be able to see how it develops and enjoy drinking the wine over the next 5 or 6 years. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, it would be great if you could press the like button. I'd really appreciate that. And if you are watching these tastings and you enjoy them, it would be fantastic if you'd consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. It doesn't cost you anything, and it really will help me to develop the channel further if I have more followers. To that end, if you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, it would be great if you perhaps passed it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. And if you have any comments or any questions about the wine or anything else related to this video, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think. As I suggested earlier, I will leave a link to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, and you'll be able to see its availability, its pricing, and also its pricing history through that page and the links on there. So thank you once again for taking the time to watch the video, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to find some time and come and join me for another tasting sometime in the near future. Till then, bye for now.